with money from his grandmother.
Uh-huh.
If it's a decent little film and maybe it competes in a couple of regional festivals and picks up a couple of good notices and maybe gets that director a little bit of recognition. Think of a movie like Winter's Bone, the movie that broke Jennifer Lawrence. Nobody had ever seen her before. And she's on the screen almost the entire film, and it's not sexy Jennifer Lawrence like we see every day now. It's Jennifer Lawrence, in the backwoods, wearing this big puffy quilted winter jacket through the whole thing, and you can't even really tell what she looks like, but she was just great. And there have been cases like that where a little movie made the difference for a composer too.
Wow.
Now, if you can't do it, if you don't have the resources to get to the places where these young filmmakers gather, if you can't go to the Sundance Festival or South by Southwest or Telluride or Toronto and kind of be that obnoxious person at the cocktail party, who makes his presence known. If there's a filmmaker there that you want to work with, somebody you really admire, you don't miss the opportunity to tell him so.
Sure.
And you have your elevator pitch ready, whatever that happens to be. But you can't always get to these places. You can't always get to where they are.
Exactly, yeah.
So you follow them through the trade magazines. You find out what they're working on, who they're working with. Is there anybody who you've got even like a 3 degrees of separation connection to that is involved with that project? And is there some way you can get your music through to the director?
Okay.
And the other thing I see people doing a lot now, and then I'll wrap this part of it, is of course, everybody's making use of social media, and every musician is making use of YouTube and SoundCloud and Bandcamp and other sites like that.
Right.
The thing about it's a whole other discussion for us to have whether YouTube really is in the long run a good place for musicians to try and sell their wares. But the fact is that it's ubiquitous now. And you had composers like Johan Johansson, who recently died tragically at like 54. But he was the guy who wrote the music for Arrival. And he had also been slated to do the music for Blade Runner, but was bumped at the last minute by Hans Zimmer. And who knows? He may have spiraled into a depression. I'm not quite sure, but he was a brilliant up and coming composer. And I say up and coming because your listeners should also prepare the fact that this is a long game.
And what do you mean by that?
If they start now, presumably at 26, 27, 28, things might be really starting to roll for them when they're 42.
Wow. Really?
And in the meantime, that doesn't mean they're not going to work.
Sure.
But they're going to do a lot of assignment jobs and things that are ancillary to the actual writing of the music. Orchestration, arranging, copying, MIDI programming, technical chores, things like that. The thing is to stay active and to always be able to say that you're working on something that you're excited about.
So for someone to be pretty young, most of our audience members are, if you're thinking about, huge movies with massive scores like Inception and Dunkirk or The Matrix, you're saying that you pretty much have to be a veteran in the music scoring game in order to even have a chance at a role of that magnitude.
Unless the only exception is if you are an already established personage, in another area of music. For instance, Win Butler, who writes and sings for Arcade Fire, got the scoring gig on that Spike Jonze movie, Her, where Scarlett Johansson played the disembodied digital voice, the digital girlfriend. He got that because he was in Arcade Fire. And the director really admired that band and admired their artistry and said, I want to work with these guys. People do that occasionally with artists like Jonesy from Sigur Rós. They do it to some extent. Danny Elfman's career was kickstarted by the fact that he was the lead singer in a popular LA cult band.
I see. Okay.
But except for those occasions where you are already a little bit of a celebrity in a related field, no, you can't go straight for those films. There is no way you can get through that wall.
Okay.
It is so... Well, okay, I'll never say no way, Walter, but...
There's going to be that one guy,
maybe nepotism might get you in.
Got it. Okay.
But no, if you're legitimate, it's just too thick a wall, and it's protected by people who are literally looking out for their survival, their livelihood, their status in the industry. Hans Zimmer, you mentioned him because of Inception. Okay, he's Christopher Nolan's go-to composer now, and he may be the best-known film composer in the world. He's certainly the only one who can fill stadiums on a concert tour.
Wow,
the way he's doing now. But I remember when he was relatively new in LA, he had a fluke streak of beginner's luck because he was nominated for an Oscar for a movie called Rain Man with Tom Cruise and Dustin Hoffman.
Yep.
And there was maybe 15 minutes of music in the entire film, and it was all synthesizers, and that's what he knew how to do. He was a protege or an admirer of people like Vangelis, the electronic composers of the 80s. And he had background in advertising, but he'd never taken on any really big, high-profile features. And I remember going to his place. It was in a little rented, warehousey kind of room on a kind of bad stretch of Santa Monica Boulevard. But the first couple of films we worked on together were there. And he was working. I mean, there was money coming in.
Right.
But again, it was minuscule.
Okay.
Compared to where he got after Lion King.
Wow. Yeah.
And, it's so... These guys... Look, I think this is the most exciting... Aside from possibly being an Indiana Jones-style archaeologist or an international playboy... like James Bond,
right,
or something. I think this is about the coolest job you can have.
It seems like it. Wow.
Because you are putting the icing on the cake.
Right.
And in a way, it's such a lovely thing to do, to be able to sit back and look at a movie that is 80% finished and say, how can we take this over the finish line?
Right. So it seems like from what we've heard thus far, there's going to be, you have to do some resume building early on, and you kind of gave us some tips about how to start that, to build the resume, to really look at the long game and to have some longevity and not look for some instant return. You also alluded to kind of being in the right place at the right time, but a lot of that seems to be being proactive about pursuing the very thing you mentioned, resume building, meeting the right people, being in the right circumstances, and maybe have some things kind of strike for you and catch fire. So from a technical standpoint, though, what does one need to focus on a composer for these monstrous films that we talked about? Is that person like a consummate composer in that they are, well versed in, all the music theory out there and can, score things by hand and sit down with some manuscript and just start jotting down all the notation? What does that look like for someone who's looking to build their technical toolbox to be a composer?
For some, that picture you just drew, I would say for a very few, that's still the way it's done. It doesn't always go with age and generation, but it tends to. James Newton Howard is a composer who fits the description you just gave. He was originally a pianist, and those piano skills help him enormously as a writer because he's really able to use that instrument as a tool.
Sure.
Whereas a lot of composers who are coming from guitar, like me, and have to adapt to keyboard as the principal vehicle for getting their music down, they're never going to have quite those skills. So they think differently and they write differently. Look, to give you two extreme examples, they used to say that composers like Bernard Herrmann, who did all the Hitchcock films, and still today, Ennio Morricone, who most recently worked with Quentin Tarantino, but is known for the spaghetti westerns and a whole bunch of huge films. These guys write directly to score paper, which is to say the full orchestral score from top to bottom, from flutes down to contrabass. And they actually write in the parts. They know the orchestra well enough. They are able to hear in their head the music that they're composing clearly enough that they can go directly to the page. That almost never happens now.
Really?
First of all, there isn't time allowed in the composer's process to do the kind of thoughtful, reflective work. You know, you've seen the film a few times, you've spoken with the director, you have an idea what he's looking for and what you're looking for, but you have to sort of work it out. You have to work out ideas on paper first, at the keyboard, etc. There's such a press of time to jump right into it now.
Right. Okay.
I don't know. I couldn't tell you today exactly what the average composer timeline is like, but you know, it used to be 4 to 6 weeks. I think it's more like, you know, it's often 3 to 4 or 2 to 3 now.
Wow.
And that's for 50 minutes to an hour of music.
That's crazy.
So composers have had to get very fast, and what that has done is it's given a sort of Darwinian advantage to the people who are best at the digital audio workstation. Famous DAW.
Exactly.
You know, the people who make themselves Logic ninjas or Cubase ninjas, you know, or Pro Tools ninjas early on, they will always work. Now, whether they also have the creative muscle to make use of all that speed, that's the big question. And if they do, nothing can stop them.
Wow.
If they're accomplished musicians, which to me just means they can play at least one instrument well.
Sure.
Not maybe at a virtuoso level, but well enough to play, to sit together with a small ensemble or band or a combo and make good noise. You know, they have to have studied not just the traditional classical repertoire, but to understand film music and write film music the way it's written now, you have to get a little bit into these odd periods, the late 19th century, the early 20th century, which is essentially romantic.
I love that genre.
Late romantic.
Yeah.
All the composers who were writing what they called programmatic music, Rimsky-Korsakov, Prokofiev, that many of the tricks of the trade come directly out of that music. Then you jump into the middle of the century and you look at people like Bernard Herrmann and how he took some of that language and, man, he molded it like clay. He twisted it sometimes, perverted it sometimes, but he made really good use of it and created something that everybody in the world recognizes as film music.
Sure.
So you got to know about that stuff, and you also have to study the work that people are doing now, both for the cinema and also for the concert hall. And I'm speaking of the sort of cutting edge contemporary composers, everybody from somebody like the Estonian Arvo Pärt to Beck, or to violinist who played, we're speaking of Arcade Fire, who plays frequently with Arcade Fire and in fact was co-nominated